Hello chess friends, it's GM Max and welcome to another Crazyhouse video. And in this video I'm actually going to share my behind the scenes preparation for a game I'm playing in the Crazyhouse World Championship match. It's one of the many matches I lose bracket of the Crazyhouse World Championship qualifying stage against the FIDE Master Royal Blue 04, who I believe is from Ireland if I remember correctly. I haven't really paid too much attention to the tournament or to Crazyhouse in general. These I'm much more interested in other variants like 4-player chess. But anyway, let's get into the preparation, and this video I'm going to share my black preparation. Now, for those of you who don't know, the opening tree is a really great resource in order to use to see if find your opponent's online games, to look up what they're playing. Although I'm not showing it in this particular game, it would be a bit confusing. I do want to show objectively the correct moves book with the injury analysis. At the same time, I will be making a lot of use of this, and I will be referring to it a lot. And I already did a little bit of research in preparation for this video, and one thing I found is that my opponent has a very narrow repertoire with the white pieces, which of course makes him a lot easier for me to target. So his main system is he plays e4, e5, and then after knight f3, knight c6, he likes to play the move bishop c4, going for the Italian game. And maybe not too surprisingly for a FIDE Master, actually he likes to play a very similar way to in normal chess. So that is after the move knight f6, which as I mentioned in the Crazyhouse e4, e5, e4 video much earlier. I do think that knight f6 is probably the best try for black here, and then he usually plays the critical knight g5 in turn. And after d5 and ed5, I've usually played the move knight d4 in the past, and has been a move that has scored incredibly well for me. But I remember in a previous Crazyhouse match, I made the mistake of playing a line that I'd scored quite well in the past in d4, knight f3, g3. My opponent prepared some very special line where I just had no idea how to deal with it. So this time I'm going to play something a little bit different to what I usually would do, and play the move knight to a5 here. And part of that is also due to seeing that my opponent has actually not had very good results overall in these lines, where even though he has a very high win percentage, he's played mostly very low-rated players and actually lost quite a few of these games to players rated like 1500, 16, 17, 1800, which considering he's rated 2100, obviously that's sort of a sign that he's kind of vulnerable in these lines. And in fact, the move he plays almost every time in this position is the move of bishop to b5, which I think is, even though it's the main move in normal chess, I don't think it's necessarily the best move in correspondence, and there is in Crazyhouse rather. I keep mixing up Crazyhouse and correspondence and malapropism, but anyway, after c6, I think that this position after dc6 and bc6 is a lot better in Crazyhouse chess than it is in classical chess, and it's because, well, black's initiative is much easier to use when you've got drops in hand. Also, the f2 point is a lot weaker in general. So here he normally plays the move of bishop e2. He has played some other moves as well, so we are going to get back to this later as also. But after bishop e2, again, I think that in this position, that the best way to play it is just to play the move h6, just like in normal chess. One point is that after h6, he always plays this move knight takes f7, but I don't think it's a particularly good move. I don't really see an easy way to follow up the attack, because I think that I'm pretty well covered with the extra piece, and white's lack in development does make it hard for, I think, to get a successful attack in. The thing is, if you play a move like knight f3 instead, I think that black is just getting a very strong initiative with moves like e4. Actually, it may even be possible to improve on the move e4, like even something like bishop c5 and going after f2 would be quite interesting, and so would pawn at h3. But I think you can't really go too far wrong with e4, because, the knight doesn't really have a great square if you do play knight to e5. Well, I think one option here that's very strong that obviously black wouldn't normally have in classical chess would be to play a move like pawn at h3. And that way we're just basically getting rid of, making a lot of weaknesses in the white structure, so that if they do play, let's say, g takes h3, well, we can go bishop to d6, sort of get rid of the knight, and then we can drop a knight on g2 and just have a very strong attack that way. So for that reason, white probably has to think about a counter-attack, and maybe pawn at g6 might be the way to do it. But it feels to me like black's initiative should be a lot stronger than white's here, that after a move like, say, queen to d to d4, then g takes f2, king d8, well, the king has a lot of room to move around in case white tries some sort of drop. And we do have the idea of pawn takes g2 as well as queen takes c5. So I think that after something like knight to g6, takes at g2, rook g1, and then something like, let's say, pawn at f3, or even pawn at d3 is also very tempting. Probably both moves are very strong, but let's say pawn at d3 just to facilitate some exchanges. Then yeah, after knight c3, Now, it feels like this has got to be just completely winning for black somehow, because white is playing without all of these pieces, and this king is just so exposed at this point. So it's a question of finding the absolute best way to finish off the game, and I think the move that would appeal to me as black is to play to move bishop to a6. Probably d takes c2 is also winning, to be fair. But bishop a6 kind of makes d2 a lot stronger, because then you're able to take e2 and drop a knight on f3, which kind of takes the sting out of knight to h8. It does seem like this line like b5 takes. Once you get that knight in hand, I'm pretty sure this is just completely winning for black, where you're going to take e2 at some point, drop a knight on f3, or if they do take, then you could drop a knight on c2, or even a pawn at c2, and yeah, it's just a completely hopeless position for white, I think, in this case. The line might go pawn at c7, takes, and yeah, bishop at e5. White can use this trick to try and win the queen, but after takes, and d2, white doesn't really have a great way to drop the queen, where it turns out that all of these points are covered by the black knights. And that's something like queen at c3, well, we can play bishop at c4, with the idea that queen takes a5 is not really something you're afraid of, because just bishop at b6, and, well, the attack is just way too strong for black here. For example, if the queen were to move to some square, then yeah, you can just take on f2, or even just take the queen, and once white loses one of his queens like this, it's just going to be game over very, very quickly with his king in the open center. Okay, admittedly this was a very long variation, but I think it's kind of useful to understand why it is that playing normally in these positions is just not going to allow white to survive. That does mean knight f7 is probably a better practical try, but after king takes f7, I think this position is basically just better for black here, where normally the move that white has played has been this move of pawn at g6, is how royal blue has been playing it. But after king takes g6, I don't really see an easy way for white to follow up this attack after pawn at h5 and king to f7. This is how he normally plays it. But he had 3 losses from here, like pawn at g6. This is how what 2 of his games went. Takes, pawn at g6, king e8, and knight at c3. And here I think there are a lot of moves that are probably winning for black. He lost to bishop to b4 and bishop to c5 before. Again, I like the idea of playing a move like pawn at h3, because again, it means that takes, you can often drop a knight on g2 and just keep on the attack on the king and leave their rook without a good square as well. And if they try something like rook g1, then yeah, you can go bishop c5. In even better version, we've got threats like sax on f2 and dropping something on e4. And it just seems to me that the position is just going to be completely decisive, with black having the lead in development, better material, and also the material in hand, whereas white has nothing to really drop to make use of the pawn on g6. So it is a position that is basically just completely dead one for black, and, well, therefore, you should probably play a little bit differently. I mean, I guess a move like d4 might be a better try, at least trying to open up the queen side and trying to open up the center here. But it still feels like black must be doing very well in this sort of position. Like, even if you just play some simple move like e takes d4. I mean, knight h4 is also very tempting, but then at least white can sort of castle, and, knight g2 is maybe not all that straightforward. But it does feel like this has got to be winning for black somehow, like even queen d5. Well, you're threatening the pawn on g2, and it's clear that black has the material and the initiative, but I do feel like it's probably better to play e d4 and just keep it simple. Because I think that if black is able to, let's say, play king h7 and safeguard the king like with pawn at g6 or pawn at f5, then yeah, it's kind of clear that white has nothing and black is just completely winning. So I think that white has to try pawn at e5 and try to complicate somehow. But I think that as long as black's a little bit careful, he should be able to consolidate. Where, of course, it is true I'm using Stockfish here to analyze the variations to make sure the preparation is accurate. And it seems that the best line for black is probably just to play king to f7 and just let black get the piece back, take some queen f6. Because the queen is doing a good job of covering the potential checks for a knight. Pawn at g6 is a pawn sack I'm not really convinced by. Maybe I think you just put the king on g8, just sort of drop something on f7 to guard the light squares. And then you'll have ideas like pawn h3, knight h4, and I think by piling up on these weakened light squares, that black will be much, much better in this particular position. I mean, knight h5 doesn't really do much after queen d6, because you can't really get the knight around to get a good drop in. Like pawn on g6, you can even run the other way if you really want to avoid any kind of danger. So anyway, that's sort of showing basically that, well, if he plays the line he normally plays, he basically gets a lost position out of the opening, or at least a very difficult position out of the opening. I remember there were a few games where he tried moves other than pawn at g6, but okay, one of those games after knight f7 and king f7, well, one of them he played a move pawn h5, which is obviously way too slow, like even if you just played bishop to c5, and just play normal moves like knight h4, pawn h3, like why is just completely busted. Likewise, a move like pawn to d3 is just way too slow here. I mean, even a move like knight h4 would be very tempting, but probably to move bishop c5 is better. Again, with ideas that you're going after the f2 square, or if castles and h3 gains a lot in strength when they don't have a move like rook g1 to defend, and, well, it's just clear that this attack kind of plays itself. Say gh3, bishop h3. Pawn at g2, you can just sack and basically just throw the pieces at the king, like king g2, and there's probably some immediate forced win, but since I don't see it instantly, I guess that a move like pawn h3 is probably quite good, where you just sack a pawn in order to bring the queen in the attack with tempo. Or if they play king g1, then yeah, pawn at g2, and I mean, with such a pawn in their throat, it just looks like black is just going to be very strong. Although, admittedly, if you don't have a way to actually follow it up, it's not so simple, because white may be able to try to play something like bishop f5, or try to get the pieces somehow. So maybe this actually is not as clear as I initially thought, and maybe it's better for black to play it a little bit differently here. Like, for example, maybe instead of this, perhaps a move like... well, it's I guess a question like what else you do instead, because it's really very consistent, but I guess something like queen d7, and kind of preparing this move is also possible. So it doesn't feel quite in the spirit of the position, but it probably should still be very good for black, where black's king is a lot safer than white's, because of having the more dangerous drops in this case. So anyway, going back to the position note from some moves ago. Well, he's also played some moves other than bishop to e2 at this point, and definitely we should have a quick look at those as well. So what if he plays bishop to a4, which actually happens to be his best scoring move in this particular position? Well, to me, it's a move that I know is a very big mistake in normal chess because of h6, e4, and then queen d4. And maybe you can still play it in a similar way, actually, in this case as well, where he only had one game with h6, but yeah, I think after knight f3, that maybe instead of e4, even though it's probably still a winning move. I'm also wondering about some other possibilities like bishop c5 or dropping a pawn at h3 also. Well, it's a case where black's just so spoiled for choice it's hard to pick a move, but I kind of like pawn at h3 just to kind of take the initiative and make it hard for him to keep his king safe. I mean, if he tries some move like, I don't know, rook to g1 to try to defend it, and avoid the sort of weakening. Well, in that case, I think bishop c5 is probably even stronger now, because if gh3, you can just go ahead with e4, and the white knight doesn't really have a good square available. I mean, if black is able to take that knight, well, the knight in hand is just incredibly strong. But if you try to move the knight, say knight h4 or something like this, then black even has moves like knight g4, where you can just sort of liquidate the material in order to get the material you need in hand. One nice tactical point is that rook g4 takes, and queen g4 is not actually winning material, because black has the move queen takes h4, and then you can meet queen h4 with knight at f3 and a mate with a rook on e1, so it's just completely crushing with tactics here. And also this kind of style I kind of enjoy playing, where you just go for just killing the opponent right off the bat, rather than just sort of make a very slow positional game. Because after with this match, I wanted to kind of get over and done with, because I mean, I don't really want to waste a lot of time playing Crazyhouse, but at least I want to, well, if I'm going to play a game, well, at least I may as well give it like my best shot, I guess. Anyway, well, and since bishop a4 clearly just loses by force, well, that leaves the move e6, which he also played in a few games, which, to me, it doesn't seem like a particularly serious try, but okay, he wants to try and be tricky. But yeah, I think after bishop e6, knight e6, and f e6, I feel like in this position, the f7 point is just very safe for black, because white doesn't really have a way to get at it with a knight, because he does have a knight in hand, and the bishop's not really that useful, and I can always drop pawns to keep the light squares protected for defense. And now he's had two games, like one where he played, well, he played this move of, what was it? Yeah, one game where he played pawn at b7, and one where he played bishop takes c6. Well, the game with bishop c6 is one where he lost to 1300, and, after takes, if white does try, like, bishop at b7, then yeah, just even bishop at d5, and you can see that black is just up material here, and he has the, the decisive attack on the light squares. So a clearly lost position where the rook is rather useless for white in hand. The rook tends to be a lot better a lot later in the game in general. But after pawn at b7, I think that again you can do something similar with c takes b5. And can't just say that the white rook is really not doing anything useful for white. I don't really see a great drop, and g2 is under attack, and if you try to defend it with rook g1, then yeah, even moves like just bishop c5, and keeping the material in hand for drops later at like knight f4, pawn e2, this kind of thing. I feel like it's just going to be completely hopeless for white in this position, where black is up material and has the better position. In any case, Well, since we can see that after bishop b5 and takes, I think white is simply in trouble here, that black already has a very serious advantage. I mean, there are other moves that white can try, but for example, bishop d3 and knight d5 just gives black a much better version of the lines that you see in normal chess. Because with knight coming to f4, obviously it's much more powerful in Crazyhouse when you've got the drops to back it up, as it were. So, okay, we can kind of conclude that basically that it's sort of... This line is a really great one for sort of punishing the opponent's tendency to try and play it like normal chess. Because if he does that, he basically is just going to lose out the opening, more or less. So what should white do instead against the move knight to a5? Well, I remember I actually had a game against Jan Lee in this line, like back when I was playing Crazyhouse, and I forgot what he did, but he did some like sacking online where he sacked on f7 and it ended up being very annoying. And actually this is the suggestion of the computer as well, to play knight takes f7. And since Royal Blue did play it in one game, we may as well have a quick look to make sure that we're ready for it. So the idea is that after king takes f7, pawn at e6, well, white is basically giving up the piece, but in return he's getting a very strong position where, you know, the pawn is obviously a bit of a bone in black's throat. It makes it hard to get some good exchanges in. So the move b3 is the one that's been the most common one in practice at a high level, but after bishop d6, black has actually scored nearly 100% from this point. So it's the only positions where maybe the Stockfish engine evaluation may not necessarily give the most accurate indication of the practical nature of the play. For example, if white plays knight c3, then I think that knight f4, well, you're definitely getting some nice attacking ideas, and if white were to castle, then yeah, you can even just play like knight takes c4, b takes c4, and then play to move bishop at g4 to kind of defend. And okay, it's one of the positions where sort of objectively speaking, white probably is better, at least according to Stockfish. But I think that with the idea of sacking on e6, we will manage to safeguard our king, like f3, bishop takes, and even though the Stockfish is claiming an edge for white, I think that with drop pawn h3 coming, that the position is actually probably very good for black, as a case where I'd actually disagree with the Stockfish assessment of the position. Of course, there are other moves I could also try, like, for example, the move pawn at f7 is also sometimes a move you sometimes see, but I think even though the king looks very awkward on e7, I don't think it's all that scary. After b4, I think we can simply take on d5, and I don't really see a great way for white to follow up the attack, whereas we can kind of just munch the pawns like bishop a3, king takes e6, and you know, if they play bishop takes f6, we can even play like knight takes c4, which seems to be a nice novelty here to get rid of the pin and not give him time for a queen g4 or a drop on e4. And if they go bishop g7, trying to complicate, and I think knight f4, and I feel like it's a very crazy sharp position, but I think that the attack is a lot stronger for black than it is for white, because white doesn't really have any good drops like a knight drop or anything like this. And after b takes c4, well, actually it's kind of a critical position. We shouldn't assume that knight g2 has to be played here, but probably it is the best move to keep up the momentum. And after king f1, then, I mean, it feels like with a knight, bishop, and free pawns now, this must somehow be very good for black. And maybe the way to do it is to play like knight at e3, should be knight at e3, not knight to e3. This line is given by the computer, and it might actually just be winning to play like this, because, you know, once you get the queen in hand, it's just going to have drops on the light squares to force the mate. But if they go king g1, then yeah, this starts to get very crazy sharp as such. Because if black takes the queen, white's idea is to go bishop at d5, king to f5, and like knight at g3. Or actually, maybe king f5 might be a bit careless. Like maybe king e7 is perhaps a safer move, so that our king is at less risk getting mated. But then after pawn at d6, white kind of gets a repetition with knight at e4, and, you know, with this sort of thing like knight c5 and back and forth. That being said, I think the odds of him finding all these moves are very, very low, so it's probably still a good line worth going into, because, yeah, obviously his position is very, very sharp. And, I mean, a move like king g1 already is like a very special move in that regard, along with the moves up to this point. So I think that's still a reasonable outcome from our perspective. And, okay, so knight f7 actually turns out to be not that scary, that even though it's a line where the engine loves white, it seems in practice black's position is easier to play in high-level Crazyhouse. Actually, the most common move for white in this position is the move of d3, which is not a move that my opponent has played yet before. In that case, I think I would probably go for knight takes c4, dc4. And I mean, I could even play a move like bishop at h5, sort of gambling that he's not going to play the move queen takes h5, which is winning for white according to the engine and also according to practice. I guess a more solid move than sacking the queen for this light square attack might be to play a move like bishop c5 instead, and it's true I could also have played it without this move thrown in. It's one of these positions where Stockfish is going to give white a winning advantage, but I think that in practice there is still quite good chance for black, and actually in high-level Crazyhouse Black actually scores a very high plus score. For example, knight takes f7 doesn't seem to be as effective when black can sort of run the king over to g8 for safety. But after move knight e4, which is the most common move in this position, trying to get some play going. Well, now actually in the Crazyhouse games, black scored very well with the move castles, with the idea that if white does take the bishop, you have bishop at b4, and basically kind of get the material back and also get the knight in hand. And with ideas like dropping a knight on h4 or even going for knight g4 here, it feels like black has a very strong attack and white must be very precise in order to not, lose the initiative. After castles, probably I would play something like knight... my first thought would be knight to g4, but maybe it's better to actually put the knight at g4 or the knight at h4, just to make sure that the f6 knight is kind of covering the light squares and, ideas of sacking on g2, maybe dropping something on h3. And okay, it's a position where I think that as far as keeping in mind that Crazyhouse is a forced win for white with best play, I think that this gives good practical chances and also is unlikely to be something he has any sort of familiarity with as well. So that's pretty much my review of the knight a5 lines, and of course it's true that because I'm preparing specifically for the opponent, that I'm not necessarily going into certain lines. I just think there's no chance he's going to play. But let's also look at quickly at a few other lines that he can play if he doesn't play this this whole like bishop knight g5, bishop b5 kind of stuff. So, for example, one move that he's played in a few games after knight f6 is the move of pawn to d3. But okay, in this case, I can sort of play my usual lines like bishop to e7. And I guess I do have to be a little bit careful because after d3, bishop to e7, if he plays, this actually does transpose to lines he often plays via the bishop e7 move order. So it might be something he ends up preparing like just to play d3 and trying to avoid theory. The thing is, if I don't play bishop e7, my position I think is just kind of bad here. So I probably should go into these lines and sort of brave whatever he tries to throw at me. But I see that normally he plays this move of knight to g5 in this case. But after knight g5, okay, I castle and... Well, I noticed that when I was looking at some of his games quickly before, that if he were to play, let's say, castles, that he seems to struggle a lot against the lines where black goes for some very quick d5. And actually, I think this shows why he should probably start with knight c3 instead in this position, because... After castles, now d5, I think, just gives black a very strong initiative with takes, where I can sort of hit the knight and also drop a pawn on h3. The extra central space advantage does really help a lot here. I see that he's normally played this move of bishop takes d5 at this point, but after bishop takes d5 and queen takes d5, for what it's worth, I think bishop takes g5 is probably also winning for black, where it is of dropping pieces on pawns on h3 or something. Well, I think after queen d5, though, this should also be very, very strong, but... Okay, now I think about it, actually, I do like bishop g5 better. I don't want to have this knight around my king, sort of harassing in that way. And then in this case, he's had a game where he played bishop takes g5, and a game where he played bishop takes c6. I mean, bishop takes c6 I'm not really concerned about whatsoever, because after bishop c1, well, he doesn't even have queen takes c1 because of the knight e2 fork, and with this pawn on b2, and still the bishop being under attack, it's clear that this is just a blunder. So he really should play bishop takes g5 first, but okay, then my queen... gets very, very active, and the pin can also be quite annoying for white in a lot of different positions. So, yeah, the game where he played knight at e4, but I think that this move actually just loses on the spot, where actually it's a very nice tactic that his opponent did manage to find in the game, where he went for queen takes g2, and then after king takes g2, his opponent played pawn at h3. But I think that knight f4 is even more clinical, after king g1 and pawn at e2. Well, the idea is that you're just going to get the queen and then mate on g2, or... in some cases, you can even take the rook if the white queen were to move away, and that's just going to give you the main material very, very directly. So yeah, it's kind of clear that white is just completely busted once he does have any real good drops to kind of hit the white king with a tempo here. So that's, I guess, why knight c3 is probably the more critical move at this point. But in that case, I like this approach of playing knight d4, and the fact that he's lost with 0 out of 3 is also kind of a good sign that sort of stopping his sort of knight h7 ideas with by playing d5 one go is probably the way to go. And it seems he hasn't really played with much theory in mind, because he played the move bishop e3 in these games, but then I think the move d5 is quite a strong gambit, where after the usual move ed5, other moves like knight d5 are going to uncover the attack on the knight, something like, let's say, knight takes f7. If he does try to sack a piece to go for the attack, even though this has scored well in high-level Crazyhouse, I think that with knight at h4, that the king is going to be perfectly safe, that, you can just sort of swap everything on f6 and f7, and still the white king is going to be a lot more exposed than black's in your rising position. But after ed5, well, black can go bishop to g4, and we kind of see black taking quite a strong initiative. Well, I've looked at these lines before, and I know that after pawn f3 and bishop h5 that black is actually better. Despite being a pawn down, we're often going to sack on f3 and just kind of get a pawn at d4 to kind of exchange material to get more for the attack for when they castle short in such positions. So anyway, I think that this line I wouldn't be too concerned about, though I do notice that at a high level the move knight takes h7 is actually the main line, and even though he hasn't played it before, I guess we should be kind of ready for it as well. Where after, I think, king h7, well, normally they play pawn at g5 and they're trying to get some sort of queen h5 attack in. But here I think that the move d5 is, again, just a lot stronger when he hasn't played knight c3, and after takes, bishop takes. Actually, I wonder if even bishop takes f6 is forced here, but it's probably the best move. And if white plays bishop takes d5, queen h5, pawn h6 is nothing for white, well, then we can just play knight to d4, and I think that this position should be winning for black with correct play, because there is a threat like to drop a pawn on e2 and a knight on f3 to win the queen. And if he tries to attack with something like queen to h5, trying to avoid some pawn at f3 drop or whatever, well, I think that then just knight at h6 is very safe, where you keep the pawn in hand to drop the pawn on c6, and, well, if pawn bishop takes h6, it's a very sharp position, of course, but I think that with pawn at g6 that we are beating back the attack, because the queen will be forced off the h-file. And after queen d1, g8, I mean, I think black is just basically, up a piece in a sense, and, well, you can drop a bishop on h5, and I think that black's big lead in development and initiative kind of speaks for itself after, knight c3 and bishop at h5, like, it should just be winning for black, I'm pretty sure. Like, if a pawn goes to f3, even bishop at h3 is one way to make sure that we destroy the, destroy the pawn cover around the king, as it were. So, in any case, it sure has played moves other than knight to g5, but this seems to be his general preference. Like, for example, after knight c3 in castles, he's usually playing, knight to g5 there as well, but of course it's just transposed to what we were looking at. And also, if he does play a move like 5 castles, then after castles, actually, this is a little bit different. I'm going to make the moves on the board as well, but I can sort of see that in this case, I might want to be a bit tricky with the move order if he plays, like, castles. And then plays knight c3, because he's trying to play like the d6 knight g5 line, and obviously it's something that he would expect me to sort of play via a different move order. So I'll probably just go h6 here and just kind of avoid this whole knight g5. Because I think that without this idea, he's going to struggle a lot to come up with a good plan. I mean, if knight d5, I can just play d6, and, well, the game kind of goes on from here. Like, definitely white is quite a lot better. But okay, I can always do things like take on d5 and drop an knight on f6, or put a bishop on h5 or g4 to cover the light squares. I mean, the computers will say, just bishop takes h6 and pawn at g6 is winning, but actually it's almost never been played. Actually, bishop h6 would be a novelty in this position, in fact. So I think there's a pretty decent chance he's not going to play it in the best version. Because if you do sack here and play pawn at g6, I think that the move bishop at e6 is quite a solid defense, and although the computers say that white is winning, I don't think it's quite as simple in practice. I mean, you have the idea of, like, beating pawn at g6 with rook to g7. So it's something I think I'd be willing to risk on the basis that it's very unlikely that he will go for this particular move order. And so I can probably, well, be kind of clever and, sort of bluff him out of the knight g5 idea in that sense. Anyway, moving on to some other things he's played other than bishop c4. Well, he's also played some games where he played the Italian with bishop to b5, as it were. Not the Italian, sorry, the Spanish with bishop to b5. But okay, in this case, I guess the line in general is not considered to be very effective in Crazyhouse chess. And looking at his score, I can see that he scored very badly against moves like knight to f6, and it's also, I think, the best move here. So that's quite a logical choice for our purposes, and, well, let's see what he is doing against the Berlin. He's actually played a lot of different moves against the Berlin, like all of knight c3, d3, bishop c6, and castles, which suggests he hasn't really got any sort of theory prepared in these lines. I think that if he does castle, then, well, there's actually quite a few moves that black can go for here, where Stockfish kind of is in love with a lot of different possibilities. But I've noticed that the move knight he takes c4 scores the best at high level, so I think this could be quite fun to play against him. Although I guess after d4, it's sort of a case where, it's not like you can just play your usual knight d6 like in a Berlin, like obviously in Crazyhouse it's a different story. But I think that the move a6 will be quite effective, because the idea of a6 is that basically you're now putting the question to the bishop, so if he does take, well, I can go d takes and just drop a pawn on h3 and just hack his king with the support of the bishop. And if he tries to avoid that with a move like rook e1, I can just put a bishop on d5 and, just kind of keep things very solid. Or Actually, maybe even better than bishop at d5 might be knight takes f2. With the idea that if he takes, I can go bishop at h4 and just kind of throw pieces at the king. Or if he goes g4, I can just play bishop f6 and say, well, okay, d5 means I get a queen in hand, and that's very bad when the king is so weak. But if bishop at knight e5, I can just play bishop e7, with the idea of just taking e5, dropping a knight on g4. And if black tries to defend it, he's just losing the initiative, and I think this should just be probably winning for black. So I think that, yeah, just playing it kind of like normal chess, and sort of punishing him for trying to play normal chess moves with... So Crazyhouse is, I think, it's going to be the way to beat this guy in general. If he does play rook e1, then I think that just something like knight f2 is, again, very strong, where I can use a very similar idea of just playing like a6, and I think even though a6 is a novelty, it does seem to be pretty effective, where again I can meet takes x with putting the bishop on h4. One thing actually I didn't explain, I guess is worth noting, is that if he does try to play it like normal chess with bishop to a4, then in that case I'd probably just play something like pawn at h3 and just leave white kind of struggling. Because I mean here his king is very open, and after rook e1 and d5, like knight takes d4 is not really working as well as in normal chess, because I can just play moves like, say, bishop c5 and, well, just throw everything at his king, and I think that black should just be winning pretty easily in such a position with the king so exposed for white. So, yeah, that's sort of my plan if he goes castles. If he plays knight c3, then, yeah, obviously this position is one that could also arise via a free knight c3 move order. And I love decent replies for black, but probably I'd just go bishop c5, castles, and, you know, just castles. I think this is a position where black can be pretty... can be pretty comfortable in general. Because he has one game against bishop c5 where this did happen. And he decided to play the move d3 at this point. But I think instead of playing the move d6 he faced before, I might try to move knight to g4 instead as a kind of, well, sort of interesting weapon, where I sort of play this line with a tempo less, and, you know, if he does play knight d5 trying to cover, well, I can play a6 and, you know, if bishop a4, even a move like b5, just kind of kicking the bishop back. And I think that with such active piece play and ideas of like dropping something on f2, like just sacking there at a good moment, it feels like it should be pretty good for black, because it can also quite easily get the material in hand, or even maybe go king h8 and f5. So I think the plans are pretty straightforward for black, whereas white is going to have to be very, very precise, I think, not to get mated in such a position when I have such a powerful bishop on c5 in support. So in any case, I think that, well, he might try also move like d3, but I mean, d3 is obviously not very critical, and I think even just something simple like bishop e7, or say d6 and bishop e7, I can play very safely and say that the bishop on b5 would really rather be on c4, and, you know, just pins like bishop g4 and knight d4. I think it should be pretty good for black in that case. And finally, if he does play bishop takes c6, well, again, it seems like just an outright mistake to play in this kind of way, you know, after takes and dc6. Like, if he plays the move knight takes e5, which he did in one game, I mean, yeah, black has a lot of good moves in reply in this case, and maybe the simplest is just to play something like even queen to d4, just like in normal chess. Because, I mean, after knight f3 and queen e4, it's pretty obvious that black has just a very big lead in development and has better pieces in hand. And, well, it's a position I think that if you don't win such a position as black, well, I mean, you should never play Crazyhouse again, I think is the way to put it. Well, at least that's what happened when I stopped playing Crazyhouse after the loss to Antich, because, like, I just played so idiotically, like, I knew that I couldn't, like, play Crazyhouse again, like, except for, you know, this match, which, well, actually, I'm not even sure why I'm playing this match, but I guess it's sort of saying, well, okay, at least it's something that can be entertaining for the YouTube community to, well, to see how, you know, to see some of my games in this way. You know, just like all of the many hours I put studying Crazy, like, I don't want to be totally to waste, so I guess that's the reason why I'm still playing this event, even though it's, like, goes against all my principles to, you know, to sort of continue embarrassing myself with such idiotic play. But anyway, going back to the to this preparation, well, I guess what else can he do? I mean, all the other lines he played, he only played in a very small number of games. Anyway, I guess one point is that he could play something like knight c3, and, you know, after knight f6, he might say, okay, I'm just going to play this system and sort of prepare something here, which would kind of avoid my free knight f6 move order a little bit. But okay, this is something we already looked at a little bit via some different transpositions, and, well, if he does try to play some move like, let's see what he's done. I mean, he has tried so many different moves, it's hard to keep track of all of them, but okay, we already looked at d3, I think, via a transposition, I believe, with d3 castles, and, well, we looked at knight g5, but I guess there are other moves he has played. You know, we already looked at castles and h6 via a transposition, but if he plays a move bishop g5 first, I think that that's something we are generally very happy to see this pin, because admittedly the bishop does neutralize bishop g5, and after d6, if he were to play something like, let's say, bishop takes f6, I mean, I'm not afraid of the move castles, because in that case, just go bishop to g4, or even the move knight a5 is also quite good, but I think this sort of thing is something where black is just much better, like takes, and if knight d5, yeah, you can just drop a bishop on h5, and it's clear the pin is just very, very bad news for white. Actually, I think I remember I prepared this for Antich, actually, for the match I played against him, so I can kind of double up on the preparation there in that sense. And if he plays the immediate bishop takes f6, trying to somehow benefit from delaying castling, I mean, I don't really buy it. It feels like white's just giving up the bishop and not really getting anything in return. After knight d5, I think that bishop at h5 is still a very good move, and like, in without white castling, it's still an incredibly annoying pin. For example, c3, you can just play like bishop c to g4. And I mean, if it's not really sure what white is doing, like if white plays rook g1, just don't take f3, and like white has nothing there. But if white plays a move like knight at e3, which has scored 3 out of 3 for white in high-level games, but probably not for a good reason though, because after takes and knight h4, I do think that the position is almost resignable for white, where you're going to go knight a5, get the bishop in hand, and black has just got a way safer king and much better piece coordination than white. So I find it hard to take these sort of moves seriously when, white is basically losing by force with such lines if black knows what he's doing. So anyway, I think that covers d3, and, I guess that, well, there is one tricky move order he could try, actually, where he might try some move like knight g5 and try to delay the move of d3, but okay, I can still play the move knight d4 in this case and still play in the same kind of spirit. And if he does play d3, then yeah, I'll just go for... Actually, it's not an interesting question, because in this case, yeah, I think that he has managed to slightly move order me in this case. I mean, I could still play d5 anyway, and maybe that's worth playing just to, well, go for this even in a slightly worse version, like with bishop to g4. Well, maybe it's not that bad, actually, because after f3 and bishop to h5, well, still his knight is a bit offside. I have ways to get material in hand with moves like knight takes d5 and going after the knight. And I think that it's very unlikely that he'll find the ancient move of king h1 that's recommended in this position. Probably it's a bit too prophylactic for his level. So anyway, I think that, yeah, this will be, well, a reasonable sort of continuation. Obviously, there's no miracle weapon for black in Crazyhouse, but I think this is probably as close as we're going to get without having to do way more study than I'm willing to do for like a line he only plays in like a few games. And yeah, he has played a few games where he has gone for like bishop takes f7 and then knight to g5, but okay, this is not a serious system, of course. Like after, like if you're going to play, you should put the pawn at d5, because after knight g5 and king to f8, there's absolutely no follow-up for white. Like if you try to play like a Yo-Yo-Say with knight d5, well, okay, it's true that to really play the Yo-Yo-Say, you have to run the timer down to 0 when you're down to 40 seconds. We have 40 seconds left. But okay, on a more serious note, knight d5 and just winning the piece will be the simplest here. So yeah, bishop f7, like, he doesn't play it properly, so I think there's nothing really to fear here. And again, if he does play something like, let's say, castles d4, then yeah, after takes and knight d4, just pawn at h3, or even knight takes d4, then pawn at h3. Like, it's clear that, with this sort of weakness, that this is very bad for white, and of course the tactical point is that g takes h3. We'll run into knight takes d4, and queen takes d4. Knight f3 does win the queen, of course, as long as I don't mouse slip. And yeah, that's just going to be game over. And yeah, white, of course, doesn't have to fall into the trap, but his position is pretty bad if we were able to take on g2 and just throw stuff at the king, like pawn h3 and stuff from there. Or even takes and knight at h4 sort of things. And the attack kind of plays itself from this point. So yeah, I think that more or less covers all the sort of serious lines he plays with with e4, e5. I don't know if there were some games where he did play the bishop c4 move order on move 2, but okay, after knight c6 he always plays knight f3, so it just ends up being a transposition. And if he plays queen h5, I can always just play like g6 and, knight f6 and stuff like queen b3. And I mean, moves like, let's say, pawn at d5 is probably just very strong here. I remember I had this in some games against Jan Lee, where after takes, I kind of know now about the improvement here for black that, instead of playing... Actually, I've already forgotten the move that I played in this position, but okay, just something like bishop to e6 ends up being very strong. And after takes, he doesn't really have a great drop in this position, because you've got moves like knight at d4, and it's just kind of very bad news for black in general. So anyway, so basically that covers e4, and yeah, he had a few games where he played stuff like c4 and stuff like 1 e3, I think, if I remember correctly. Okay, I had a few games with c4 and a few games with d4. But I still highly doubt he's going to sort of play this because he played in such a small number of games, to be honest. So, I mean, if he does play like d4, then I'm probably going to play something like knight to f6 and if knight c3, d5, just play the usual g6, bishop, g7, castles kind of setups I'm used to playing. Although maybe I'll do it a little bit different, like play h6 and then g6 just to kind of avoid any preparation like knight 3, h6. So that way I'm able to play the g6 lines where I'm not running into the annoying bishop g5 and bishop f6 ideas I indicated in my d4 video. So that's probably what I'm going to go for there, or knight f3. Again, a similar thing, like probably just going for d5 and like the h6 move order. Because if he goes bishop to g5 or something, then yeah, I mean in that case I can still go h6 and maybe even play like a g5 line. So just to get him out of his preparation and get him in a position where h4, g4 is going to be less effective when the knight is not able to move to f4 efficiently, as it were. So that's probably the way to kind of punish these weird move orders he might try. And yeah, c4 probably is going to play like a King's Indian, like knight f6, g6, bishop, g7, and okay, it's not the sort of thing that really requires a detailed preparation. So I think it's going to be more than sufficient just to play by analogy in that sense. I guess if I want to punish his move order, probably e5 is a better way to do it. Like just go for an open Sicilian. I guess I could do that as well, and probably that would also be fine. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up my preparation for playing with the black piece against Royal Blue 4, FIDE Master. And well, I think hopefully that this video has given you some insight in how you can sort of play to try to punish players who play a bit too chess-like in Crazyhouse chess, such as my opponent. Well, often a good way to do it is just to kind of play some line where they feel like they're playing some normal theoretical opening, but where it just doesn't work in the Crazyhouse version. And you find some concrete ways to punish that. I think you saw how I did it in like the knight a5, 2 knights I mainly focused on this video, where the drops like pawn at h3 and knight h4. Obviously, you don't have them in normal chess, but just makes black's initiative so much stronger by comparison. So I hope you guys found it insightful. Certainly if you learned something or if you enjoyed the video, do make sure to leave a like and also comment below with your thoughts, especially if I made there's anything that I couldn't have played better or to improve. Of course, you can always share that as well to make these videos better and better. And do make sure to subscribe as well if you're new to the channel for more of my Grandmaster chess content. Alright, see you in the next video, guys.